Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I know I haven't posted in quite a long time, but I'm really excited to start getting back into recording these game development videos. So I hope you guys learn a lot, or you at least find it interesting to watch. And in this video, I'm going to be designing a new material in Substance Designer for a new video game project that I've been working on. So what this is going to be is a stone tile floor, but really like damaged and old looking, like something you would find in a dungeon. So I will call it Dungeon Ornate Stone Tile Floor. So that way when I look at my files later, I will know exactly what I'm talking about. So I'm starting just creating a base material, and let me make sure I'm recording quickly. Alright, cool. So now I'll drag the base material into the 3D viewport, so now I can see what I'm working on. And since this is a primarily stone material, I can switch the material preset to dielectric, so that way it is non-metallic. So perfect, that's what we want. And now in the channel view, I will add the height user-defined map. So now we can start technically like sculpting this 3D cube here however we want, using grayscale inputs. So I'm going to go ahead and add in a tile generator. And this is how we will start designing the floor. So right now it's 10 by 10, and it's just using a brick pattern. So we don't want either one of those. So I'm going to switch the brick pattern to an image input, so that way we can design the input that the tile generator will display ourselves. So I'll start with the quick shape. It's just going to be a square scaled down to 0.99. So there we go, that's my shape. It's on image input, and now I will switch the X amount to 4 and the Y amount to 4 as well. Okay, so now we will start sculpting this brick, or really this tile. So a quick bevel, just so we can view it a little bit better. And now I want to start adding details to the tile itself. So using our blending modes, I can subtract a little bit of the tile and lower down the opacity so it's less dense, I guess, less deep. Alright, and now I'm going to go into patterns, and I can just take this fibers 1 pattern, and I'm going to use this to create a trim for this tile. So I'm going to increase the tiling on this. And then I can blend it with just a simple shape that I can use as a mask for the blend. So that way we can just get one strip of tile. Or actually, I might be able to go into the tiling modes here and only do horizontal. Alright, so I can do that too. Sort of overthinking that. So what we need is a transform, and copy can work here. And I'll just lower down the opacity on this copy blend mode here, so now we can see this pattern 1. I think it's a pattern, yeah, this fibers 1 showing up on our tile, which is pretty cool. And now I will just transform it to the spot that I want. Okay, so right there looks pretty good. Alright, so now I'll do another transform, and I want to rotate it 180 and blend these back together. So now we have tiles. So now we have fibers on both sides. and then I will blend it once again and add it with another transform of itself, but rotated only 90 this time. Then add that together. So now we have this here, and we have the trim on all four sides of the tile. Alright. And now, in order to stop all these edges from overlapping each other, I'll just create a simple shape, put that into the opacity slot. So it looks like 0.85 works. And I'm actually just going to create one more blend, because you can see that when we put the shape into the mask of this, it only affects half of the trims, only the trims on the foreground, but we will want to affect the foreground and the background. So what we can do is blend it one more time, but instead of blending anything, we're just going to put all of this into the foreground. So now when we do this, it will get everything, because all of this is in the foreground. Alright, nice. So now we have this, and what I'll do is copy all of this one more time to create a mask, which I'll explain in a minute. But first, I want to frame all of this and call this tile edge trim, just so I know what it refers to. And then I'll take this, frame it again, and call it tile edge trim mask. So now we want to drag the output of the mask into this copy and turn up the opacity. But what I want to do now is replace this fiber with a rectangle that about is the same shape as it. It has the same dimensions. And it's going to take a little bit of trial and error. Yeah, it's not exactly right. So I'm just messing with the transform a little bit, and I think that looks pretty good. The shape definitely is a bit bigger than what it's supposed to be, so let's change it. Scale it down a little. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Okay. So now when we look in this height map we have here so far, which essentially this is just a height map, you can see that we get a lot of blending here, where the two edges blend together, and it does not look that great. And also, I have to scale this down a little bit. Okay, that looks good. So yeah, it doesn't look great, so we need some way of either blending these together or just putting another shape there instead. So I'm probably going to opt for just putting another shape there instead, which seems a little bit easier. So I'm going to blend this, and we need to put some type of shape in every corner. So I'm going to scale this down to a size that seems about right. And I'm just going to lower the opacity of this copy right now so that we can see what we're doing. So using this transform, I'm going to put this shape right into the corner. Also, the shape is a little bit big still. So let's try 0.07. Alright, so it's pretty much right in the corner. And now what we can do is mirror grayscale. And keep in mind that when we transform this to the right position, it's in the top left of this UV map here. So now, when we plug it into the mirror grayscale, you can see it's already working right here. It's just mirroring across the x-axis, which is shown in the mode here. And we can also switch the offset as well. But since we don't want to do this twice, we just want one node here to mirror it across all four corners. We can use the mirror corner. And you can also change the corner type, so it's in the top left right now. But if we were to say bottom left, you can see it all goes away because there was nothing in the bottom left. So we will use the top left, and we can also drop this in as the mask. Switch the opacity back up. So that looks pretty good. But now I'm going to copy this, and we're going to create a nicer shape to go in this corner. And we'll replace that with the foreground. So the scale of this was 0.07. So what I can do is create a new shape, switch it to 0.99, and then do a transform. And hypothetically, if we get rid of the tiling mode and we switch it to 7%, now we have the same shape as here. So now when we work with this shape, it's not as hard because we're using a larger shape, so we don't have to zoom in as much. So that helps a little bit to just put in another transform before the actual transform to adjust the scale. Okay, so now we're going to do some more blending modes to create a more complex shape. I can switch that to like 0.5 or something. Doesn't really matter because this is such a small detail that it won't be seen up close too much anyways. And now I'll create another smaller shape, rotated 45 degrees, and scale that down, and add it. Alright, that looks pretty good. So now I'm going to sort of condense this a bit, frame it, and call it Tile Edge Trim Corner Pieces. So you can see pretty quickly we can start to create a pretty nice looking tile. Alright, so now for more detail, I'm going to create a new shape and add it back into the middle of this tile. So about there. So this is our final height map now. Looks pretty good. I'm thinking if there's anything else I might want to add to it before we go forwards with the tile generator. And I think actually I want to put some lines through the middle of it, like some sort of diagonal lines, so that when we put some random rotation on these tiles, it will make a nice little pattern. So We're going to create a new blend mode. I only want it to affect this middle portion that I just added in. So I'll take this shape again and put it in the opacity slot. And now I want to go for a gradient axial reflected, which doesn't look like much on its own, but when you put a edge detect on it, you get these nice looking lines. So now I'll invert these lines, and I'll use them to subtract from this main shape. So now we have this kind of pattern going on. And you can see how just adjusting some of these points can affect the way that it looks. Nothing too drastic, but just the angles of the line. I think the edge width of 2 is pretty good. Edge roundness won't really affect anything because the roundness stops before the mask, so we can't really see any of that. But if we were to scale up the mask, we could start to see the roundness. But for now, since we can't see it, I'll just turn it down. And tolerance won't really affect much as well. So alright, here's our base tile. And it looks pretty good. So now a lot of the work comes with this tile generator. And just messing with a lot of these options that we have. So it's nice that it's easily accessible, you know, just a simple node, and we have a lot of control over how this is going to look. So the first thing that I want to change, you could change the offset, or actually the offset random. But since I want this to be a tiling material, and I don't want it to be too complex when I do UV mapping onto some geometry later, I don't really want to mess with the offset too much. But the rotational random, you can see switching it to something like 5 can give you some really cool results, but that's just too much. So I'll do 0.01. And even that might be a little too much. So let's try 0.005. Alright, so 0.01 I guess is doable. For me personally, I just don't want it to, if we look on this, I don't want it to just go too much past the edge of the UV map, because then that can cause problems when we do some UV mapping onto geometry later. So you can see it's going off just a little bit, but not too much. If we were to turn it up a lot, then that starts to be bad. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Also, I want to change the rotation random of every tile individually, just between 90 degrees, 180, and whatnot. So just the way that they're oriented to begin with. So that is this rotational random up here in the pattern slot. So just changing that, you can see that now the tiles are all facing different directions, and gives us some cool little zigzag patterns with this gradient axial reflected that we put in. So that looks nice. And finally, I think the last thing I want to do is we want to sort of change the luminance random of these tiles, because that will make some look more bumped up or sunk deeper than other tiles. So if we change that, you can already see that we're getting that effect. And also, if I go put on normal and ambient occlusion, we'll start to see that a little more. So go ahead and do that quickly. And that AO is a little bit strong, so I'll change the height depth down to 0.01. And so yeah, now you can really see that some tiles are pretty submerged, while others are elevated. And you can see that in this height map here as well from the tile generator. So the only problem is that every tile is still flat, you know? The luminance random only affects every tile individually. So within each tile, you have no difference in height. So every tile is just completely flat. So instead of doing luminance random here, what I'm going to do is multiply this base tile by a slope. So let's do that instead. So I'll blend it with a gradient. So I'll choose gradient linear 1. Multiply. And now that we're doing this, we don't need the luminance random anymore. So now you can see that every tile is being sloped. And also, if we were to get rid of the rotation random in pattern, you can see that every tile is sloped the same way. And now it looks more like shingles on a roof. But doing this rotation random really helps because now it's very hard to tell and it doesn't look so repeating anymore. Alright. So now the only problem is that now that we have so much slope in these tiles, where the tiles blend in with the ground looks pretty bad. Looks really flat. So the way to fix this is we need to create some ground underneath the tiles. So for this, I'm just going to do a simple height blend with the tiles on top. And now we need to create some type of dirt below. So I'll just use the clouds 3, drop that into the bottom, and already you can see that that looks pretty cool. But I also want the dirt to be more complex than that. So I'm going to blend the clouds 3, the clouds 1, using a multiply. So that way we get a little bit more variation. Then I also want to see what other nodes we have. Alright, so I'll take dirt 3. I'll do another blend. And I can add that on top. And I can change the opacity as well. So I did 0.25, and now we can see some nice hard dirt specks on top. Alright, so now I'll just drag this height blend out this way because we're not actually done with the tiles yet. And I'll drag the tiles back over this way. Alright, cool. So now the next thing that I have to do is create cracks in these tiles because I don't want every single tile to be intact. So what I'll do is create a cell node, and I'm going to use cells 4 in order to determine which cracks are and which tiles are intact and which tiles are broken and in pieces. So I want the scale to be something low, maybe like 8, and we don't want to use every single cell. So I'll do a histogram select in order to pick and choose which ones I actually want to use. So in order to do that, we'll just crank down the position. And 0.04 seems like a good amount. And what I'll do is after this tile generator, we'll do a blend. And I'll take this histogram select. So that's what it looks like right there. But instead we can invert this by doing a subtract blend mode, and now we use these fragments here from cells 4 to sort of subtract and chip away at these tiles. So you can see that these tiles are broken. Some of them are just broken halfway, not completely. And you can still see the tile below, but it's just at a lower depth. But if you wanted it to be a clean break everywhere, what you could do is put a levels node in the middle of the histogram select and the blend, and just really crank down this white input value. So now every tile is broken clear through. But I don't want that either. I kind of want little chips at some points in the middle. So I'll just take the histogram select itself without editing it at all with the levels. So now this is our material here. And now you can see these tiles look extremely clean and brand new despite these cracks. So I'm going to grab another cells 1, or actually I'll do cells 3, and we're going to increase the hardness of these cracks, and I'll blend it with this output here. So what we're essentially doing here is that anything here that has height to it, so any tiles, we're going to subtract some cracks from them. So let's change the blend node to subtract. And then also what's being subtracted is, what we're doing is we're subtracting cells 3 from this blend node here. So what we're subtracting is going to be shown up in white. So what we're really doing is we're subtracting these fragments and not the cracks themselves. So we have to just quickly invert the cells node, and now you can see cracks appearing all over these tiles. And we can even change the size too with the scale. You can see it's pretty high right now, it's 32. So I think something like 18 looks a bit better and more realistic. And I think the strength of 1 is good. But the only thing is, every tile shouldn't be uniformly cracked. So we need some sort of mask here in order to determine which tiles will be cracked and which won't. So what I'll do is take a tile generator, the same one that we used to create these cracks, to create these tiles. But the only thing is, instead of using the image input, I just want to use a simple square. So if we take a look at this now, it's just a bunch of squares being rotated. But we don't want there to be any rotation random here. So I'll get rid of that. But now you can see it's just a simple white square, and we can't tell which tiles are where. So here we'll crank up the luminance random. So now whichever tiles are white will have cracks on them, and whichever ones are dark will have subtle cracks or no cracks at all. So we'll drag this into the mask of the cracks. So now you can see that this tile up here, where it's extremely black in the tile generator, has extremely subtle cracks. But one that's white, like this one, has very deep cracks. Alright, so that looks good. And I like the way the cracks turned out. The only thing now is that you can see that when we chip these tiles, you can sort of tell that it's just using a cells node, and that we're not actually using the position of the tiles themselves in order to influence anything. So it just looks like these cracks are just random and just sort of overlaid on top of the tiles. But instead we want it to actually be affected by where the tiles are. So in order to do that, we'll take this tile generator that we created again, but the one with just black and white squares. And we're going to take this histogram select, and we're going to use a directional warp. Using the histogram select in the input and the tile generator in the intensity input. So now when we bump up the intensity to something like 20 and change the warp angle, or maybe even more, like 50, it's actually being affected by where the tiles are, which is very cool. So I'll change the degrees to maybe 180. And that looks pretty good right there. There's our tiles height map. And all the way over here is where we mixed it in with the dirt. Okay, so now I'm going to drag these cells that we use for the cracks over this way. And now we're going to create some smaller edge chipping using slope blur grayscale. So we plug our blend mode, our main texture, into the grayscale, and for the slope we need some type of noise. So I'm going to go with Perlin noise. Just do that there, and you can see it's extremely intense right now. So I'm going to change the intensity maybe to 1 for now, and that's still a lot. So maybe 0.05. And I can just edit that later. But the key things to do are to increase the samples. So I'm going to turn the samples all the way up. You just have to be mindful that if you're using a substance in a game engine in real time and you're having it change over time, higher samples will probably slow it down and be more intensive. But for me, I'm just going to be exporting this as some textures, so the amount of samples I use doesn't really matter as much. So for mode, I'm also going to do min, because blur can actually just blur out the texture, but I want this to look like some sharp damage that we're inflicting on these tiles. So min is better for that. So I want this to be some bigger noise, so 32 is fine for that. I can change the intensity. I might do 0.025, so half of what we did, just because it was sort of doing a little too much there. And now I want another slope blur grayscale. And I'm going to use Perlin noise again. The only difference is that now I want a smaller, more intense effect. So I'm going to bump it up to 64 in the scale this time. Still want the samples to be high. Still want a min blending mode. But now the intensity will probably be a little bit higher. So let's try 0.05. And honestly, that's still a little much. So let's do 0.025 again. Alright, I guess that's fine. And now I'll do another slope blur grayscale with an even smaller Perlin noise, so this time 128. Now I'm really going to have to turn down the intensity because you can see that one is very strong. So we'll do 0.01. And now I'm going to do one final slope blur grayscale. And this time, instead of using Perlin noise, what we want to do is give this a very realistic stone texture to it. So I'm going to use a fractal sum base, which is, you can see, extremely fine. Has a very fine texture to it. So I'll use that instead. And you can see without it, our texture looks very smooth, but when we enable it, we get a very nice stone chipping look. Alright, so now I'm going to save this in my game assets quickly. Probably should have saved it a long time ago, but that's fine. Alright, so now the last thing I'm noticing about these tiles is that the tiles themselves have no texture to them. There's a lot of texture around the cracks, but just the tile itself has no texture to it. So I'm going to go back to where we finalized the tile, but before we put the gradient linear multiply on it. So right here, I'll create a new blending mode quickly. And I'll just take some Gaussian noise drop it on top in the foreground, and subtract. So you can see now we have all of these pores in the stone. You can see it pretty clearly here. Only problem is that that's way too much. So in the blending mode, I might drop it down to like 0.1, just so you can barely see it. But it still does give the stone some texture. So that's all I really wanted. Okay, now we can condense this again now that we're done. So there's our final height blend. The only thing is I feel like this looks too run down. So what I'm going to do is first of all change the subtract of these small cracks to maybe half of that, so 0.5. Maybe even less, maybe 0.25. Yeah. And also in the height blend, I think there's too much dirt on top of some of these tiles. So I'll change the height offset to 0.75. So what that will do is it will extrude the tiles out even more. Alright, so now the dirt is more of like a background piece to the tiles instead of, if we go back, the dirt is sort of overtaking the tiles. So if you really wanted, just say like 2 variations of these tiles, you could just export it once with the dirt sort of overtaking the tiles, and then once with the tiles pretty far in the foreground. So you have like 2 different versions to play with in your environment, which I might actually do myself later. Alright, so that looks good. What I'm going to do now is start adding in some very simple color. So I'll enable the base color in the user defined maps, and I'll start with just 2 uniform colors blended together. And we want the copy mode here. Okay. So this is how I usually set up my colors. And now what we need is some way of creating a mask here so that we can determine the stone from the dirt. So what I usually like to do is create a blend mode here. And let me actually label some of these. So dirt, edgeware, alright, just so we're a little bit more organized with our setup. So this one I'm going to call dirt mask. And in order to create a mask for the colors, we're going to take both imports into the height blend. So we have the dirt in the height bottom, and we have the slope blur grayscale where we were blurring the tiles, and that's the height top. So we'll take the height top and the height bottom and subtract them. And what that does is it tells us where there's dirt, but where there's not tiles. So you can see anywhere that has dirt is more tinted white, where the tiles are almost completely black. So if we take this dirt mask and we drop it into the opacity of our colors, and we start changing these colors around, you can see that this top node here is being affected and being colored however we want. So we can go for a more realistic dirt color, something like that, and a realistic stone color. And now we've already started to color our tiles in pretty quickly. The only problem is that some places that should be clearly dirt are still being tinted by the stone because this mask itself is not strong enough. So what we can do is stretch this out a little, put in a quick levels, and now we can start to adjust. So just by dragging this white down, now we're really starting to change the opacity of this dirt, and now it's becoming extremely strong. And less of the tiles showing up, whereas if we change it the other way, we almost get rid of the dirt mask completely. So I'll drag it out until it's pretty strong. So yeah, something like that. And now that we can really visualize where there's dirt and where there's stone, I'm starting to notice that the dirt is actually still piling up on the stone more than I wanted. So I'm going to take the height blend again and change the height offset to 0.85. Okay. And also this middle slider here will kind of determine if we want the edges of the dirt to be blurred and stretched out, or if we want them sharp and in. And I want them sort of sharp because I don't want the dirt to overtake the tiles completely. So something like that will do. So just playing around with these sliders, you can get all different types of effects. Alright, cool. So now instead of using a simple uniform color, what I'll do is create a gradient map. So I'll take this height blend, drop that in here. Take this gradient map, put that in the background. And now we'll start creating some gradients. So in the gradient editor, whatever is black, I want to be a bit darker colored. And whatever is white in the height map, I want to be a more natural stone color. But this is probably too dark. So we can do something like that. Okay, so now we just colored in our stone pretty simply here. And I can do the same thing with the dirt. So a new gradient map to replace this dirt color. And use the same height blend as our input. And now we'll create some data points on this gradient editor again. So anything dark can be a dark dirt. Anything light can be a very light dirt. And once again, I sort of chose too dark of a color. So something like that. So now we've already pretty quickly made some very simple base colors for our stone. Alright, so now I want to add more detail, so we'll create a new blend. Yeah, okay, a new blend with a new gradient map. And now after the height blend, I want to create a new blend, but I still want it to be the height blend that's plugged into these gradient maps. Now I'll take this blended height, move it into the background of this new blend, and this is going to be a max lighten. And now we want a tile sampler, and the output of that will go into this blend. Now I also want a new shape, which is going to be a paraboloid, and that will go into the pattern input. And I want the pattern to also be a pattern input. So now our paraboloid is being tiled all across this texture. Also, so I don't have to do all of the edge wear again, I'm going to copy all of this edge wear here and drop it down here, which is why it's sometimes helpful to put frames around everything you do, so you can locate everything. This isn't too bad here, but sometimes substances can get pretty cluttered with all the different nodes. You know, I've had substances that take up tons of space, and it's very hard to find where everything is. So I do recommend labeling everything that you do. So I'll take this slope blur output, put it into the pattern map instead. And what do we want to blur? We want to blur this paraboloid here. And these blurs were all customized specifically to blur out this entire large set of tiles here. But that's not going to be the same settings for just blurring one simple paraboloid here. So we're really going to want to do less scale and more intensity. So yeah, I'm doing an intensity of 15 for this one with a scale of 4, just in case you're following along. For the Parallax noise, I might do a scale of 8 with an intensity of 8. And then one more time, intensity of like 16. And then the fractal sum, we can just turn up the intensity on that too to 1. Alright, so now we have these rocks. The only thing is I feel like I might have done too much with this first Parallax noise, so I'm going to turn the intensity down by half. What about, okay, so 2. 2 looks pretty good, and this one maybe 0.4. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And now I'm just going to do a quick warp on this. And we need a Parallax noise for the input. And a pretty low scale, maybe 8. Okay, so that looks good. So now what I'll do is take a cells, turn it down to something like 8 in the scale, and do another histogram select. just because I want just a couple shards. I'm actually going to lower the scale even more. And I don't know if this will look too good, I'm just experimenting. But I could subtract this here. Maybe with the levels. So you get some varied shapes. Okay, so we have a good rock creator here. And what I'll do is copy it. And I'm just going to create 2 or 3 versions of rocks that I like. And I'll change the pattern input number to 2 as well. So now this tile mapper is using 2 separate inputs. This one I'll increase the histogram select, and you can see it working on half these tiles. Something like 0.53. And then for this one, 0.07 looks good. Alright, and obviously you can really see the pattern here. You know, it's obviously very obvious what's going on here. So now we want to make it look pretty convincing. So that's really just messing with all the settings in this tile sampler. So first I want a lot more rocks. So I can go 64 by 64, but you can see that it scales them all down as well. So to fix that, we'll just increase the base scale from 0.8 to something like we had before. So maybe 3. And then you can see they're all overlapping one another now. It's hard to tell what's going on. So I can bump up the scale random as well. And now they're all separated. You can see we have some small ones, like we had when we first bumped up the tile sampler, but also some large ones like before. So the scale random is definitely really useful. Also, bump up the position random the full way, and the rotation random. And now we just have some cool rocks scattered around. And the next thing is mask random. I might want to mask maybe half of these. And even that's too much. So we'll try 0.75. And yeah, that looks pretty good. So here's our new height map. And I'm going to use the output of this tile sampler here as our mask to determine where the rocks are. So I'll just drop that into here. Now you can see all the rocks are colored dark because right now this gradient map has no information in it. So before we mess with the gradient editor, I want to fix this mask a little bit because you can see the edges of these rocks are either blurred or fading and it doesn't look too good. So we can just fix that with the quick levels. I'll drop that down here. I'll frame it. Call it rocks mask. Now I'll mess with the levels. So what we want to do is change the levels in a way so that the rocks themselves are colored pretty well, but we also don't have bleeding over the edges. Like you can see here, the tile itself is being colored the same way as the rocks, which doesn't really make any sense. So that just means we have to turn this slider back up a little bit. And not every rock is going to be perfect, but I'd say that overall that's pretty good. You can see it's not always going to be the perfect solution because these rocks here aren't fully colored completely. But let's find another example quick. Yeah, this rock is bleeding over the edge, so it doesn't always work, but at this distance it should be good enough. Alright, so now let's do a quick gradient map. So the darkest parts of the rock will obviously be darker, but lighter at the top. For some reason it's not actually updating. Let me do a new gradient editor. Or a new gradient map, I should say. Oh, I see. Yeah, I just forgot to put in the input. That's my fault. Yeah, I can't believe I didn't notice that, but it's okay. Drag this back down. Yeah, I'm just tweaking some stuff. So we have a little dirt in there. Some very, very subtle top edges. And overall that looks pretty good for the rocks. And also I'm going to make 2 gradient maps for the rocks. So I'll frame this, call it rock colors, and I'll blend both of these together to create the final rock output. And one of these gradient maps will be different. The rock is going to be a lot darker. And I can delete a lot of these that I don't need. cool. And I'm going to use a simple clouds node, so clouds 3, to blend them both together. So some rocks are a lot darker and some rocks are lighter. Okay, so overall I think that works pretty well. Okay, so now I want to edit the tile color a bit more. So I'm going to grab some, let me see, some edge damages. And you can see that this uses ambient occlusion and curvature. So I'll take the ambient occlusion node, drag that into there, and I'm going to grab the normals and add it into curvature. And then we'll just create a curvature node on that string, bringing the normals over to the curvature. So here's our curvature map. We can change the intensity, and that will actually affect the damages, which is cool. And I'm going to take this damages, put that into the mask of the new blend mode, take the gradient map, put that into the background, and then I'll do a new uniform color, which will just be white. And now wherever there's damages, it will show up as white on our texture. So the damages aren't much right now, and changing these sliders doesn't do much either. So when that happens, I just like to change the curvature, really bump up the intensity of that. And now we can see all the damages coming onto our tile. And here's our old texture, which looks very boring compared to our new one. So you can see that makes a giant difference. And now we have all these nice damages affecting even these little trims. So it looks really cool. I'll take all these nodes, slide it over. And next up, we can do, let's do some, I'll just copy this edge damage and I'll add it on the rocks as well. So one more blend, background, edge damages in the mask, this white uniform color there. And the only thing is, I'll have to change the edge damages because it won't be the same for the rocks. And also I don't want it to be as clear on the rock, so I'll just change the opacity down to 0.5. And I might even give the rocks their own curvature map. So I'll do a new normal going into curvature with a new curvature map. So now the rocks have their own. So that way I can change the rock's curvature independently of the tiles, which is pretty useful. So I'll change the intensity of this one to 15. And now that shows up really nicely, but I'll turn the opacity back down to 0.5. Also, I still feel like there's too many rocks, So I'll change the rocks mask, or the rocks tile sampler, and the mask random of that, if I can find it. Okay, so it's at 0.75 right now, so I'll try 0.85, and that looks a bit better. Maybe even 0.9. Yeah. Alright, cool. So now, as far as this dirt gradient map, it could use a little bit more detail as well. So a new blend with the same edge damages as the tiles and the same white color. And I'll just change it down to some like 0.1, so extremely subtle, maybe 0.25. Just to give it a little bit of like some grain to it. So you can see in a heavily dirt area, this is what we had before, this is what we have now. And then I'll just blend it with, I think we used dirt 3 before. So yeah, we used dirt 3 here to add some extra height to the dirt. So now I will use dirt 3 again with a new uniform color. To add some extra pop to the dirt. Change the opacity down to like 0.5. Alright, so this is what our color map looks like now. Okay. So now also I'm thinking that I want to rotate the tiles 45 degrees so that they're diagonal. So I'm going to put a transform here. Rotate it 45 degrees. And you can see that the colors don't really keep up with that because they're using their own dirt mask. So I need to take this levels here and also transform it by 45 degrees. So now everything is still consistent, but it's not tiling too well. So what I'm going to do is in this transform, I'm going to scale it down by 5%. So I'm going to put 95 into the stretch, and then I'll just apply within height on both of these transforms. And now you can see that the corners are all joining up. So I'll go ahead and save that. And here's what our base color now looks like. Okay, so next up I'm going to play with adding a little bit of dirt on top of these tiles. So I'm going to look for dirt. And I will go with edge dirt, maybe. So let's just try this out quick. Make a new curvature map. So here's what the edge dirt gives us. All right, let's try that out. Doesn't look too bad. Yeah, I actually like the look of that. So now we have dirt on these tiles. And I don't want the edge dirt to affect the dirt really itself, or at least not as much as it is. So I'm going to blend this, put this in the foreground, and find this dirt mask, and put this in the opacity. So now it's only affecting the dirt. So what I can do is take the string here, just do invert grayscale. And now it's really only affecting tiles. And then also, I don't want it to affect every single tile. So I'll do a new blend, put this in the foreground again, and get a clouds 3. So now it's affecting every tile, but not to the extent that it was. And here is our new texture. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and sharpen this up just a little bit. Just a little bit. So only 1 in the intensity of this sharpen. But that's just to make the details just pop a little bit more. Let me make sure I'm still recording here. Okay. Alright. So now the last step really is to do the roughness. So I just enabled the roughness, and you can see it's extremely shiny all the way across, which is not what we want. So put a new blend mode in, grab a new uniform color, and make it grayscale. We need 2 of those. And now we want to use the dirt mask as the deciding factor between the 2 roughnesses, because the dirt and the stone will not have the same roughness. So we'll control the dirt here. I might go 0.4. And for the stone would be a little bit more shiny since on the surface. So maybe 0.3. And maybe the dirt can actually be 0.5. So here's our simple roughness map. I'm going to create a new blend for both of these. And I'm just going to duplicate both of these as well. So here in the bottom we have the tile roughness, on top we have the dirt. And now I'm going to grab our height and use that in the mask. So right now you won't notice any difference because both colors are the same, but now I'm going to make the dirt 0.4 here and the stone 0.2. So now you can see we're getting some good changes in the roughness just based on this height mask. And I might actually want to make the stone rougher, so let's do 0.4. So we have, okay, this one should be 0.3. Okay, so there's our simple roughness mask to start. And now I'm going to do the rocks roughness. So use the rock mask in the opacity. And since there's nothing in the foreground, you can see the rocks are extremely shiny. So I'll just copy a uniform color over. 0.5 sounds good. And drop that in for the rocks. Alright. So now for the tiles, do a new blend, and I want to take the tile edge damages, and wherever there's an edge damage in the tile, basically in the color, I want it to be shinier. So I'll darken this down to 0.3. Or maybe I want it to be rougher. Yeah, let's go with rougher. And now for the rocks. Wherever there's edge damage, I think just to make it pop a little bit more, I might want to be shinier, but I'm really not sure. Alright, where's the rock edge damage? Okay, right here. So there's shinier, and there's rougher. I think I like shinier. So I'll go with 0.1 for the color of that. So now here's our new and improved roughness map. You can see it's a lot more detailed now. And we're just extracting the same information that we use to create the roughness. Because you don't want to build up a whole new set of information for your roughness map, because then it won't really behave the same way as you would expect with the colors. For instance, if you used one type of crack to create some nice white edges on your tiles, but then you used a whole new type to create the shininess for your roughness, they wouldn't align. So where it's white wouldn't necessarily be rough. So you just want to use the same information you use to create the color map, and just really plug that in to your roughness map, and then everything will cooperate nicely and your texture will be cohesive and make sense. So that's what I did here, and you can see quickly I just took all the detail from this base color and I just made a roughness map super fast. The only thing I would change is that the dirt itself almost has no texture to it. So I'm thinking, instead of using the dirt height map, which is just relatively dark, I might use an actual dirt noise, like maybe like dirt 1. So that will give more detail than we currently have. Yeah, that looks much better. And now we can actually see some little specks in the color of the dirt, or in the roughness of the dirt. So that looks cool. And the roughness looks good. So now I'll take this color here, and before we sharpen it all up, I want to add some streaks. So I'll just use grunge map 003. I'll copy a color over, and now we have some streaks. But obviously I wasn't really going for that, so I'll lower the color, lower the balance of our grunge map so that the streaks are pretty small, and maybe change this to 0.25. And then I'll use the same streaks here to affect the color. So right now, it's just completely shiny. So I'll do a new uniform color, maybe something like 0.2. And we don't want it to completely overtake the roughness map we already built. So I'll put the opacity down to 0.5. Alright, so now, before we finalize this base material, pretty much the last step I want to do is put in one of these water level nodes, which are super convenient for adding some water around your texture. And they have a lot of control over it too. So I'll take all of our maps, drag them into here instead by holding shift. And now we'll just transfer it all over. It's important to make sure that you're dragging everything into the proper channels. And now our base material is being affected by this node, which is really cool. The water level is definitely too high. You can see if we change it down to 0, it has almost no effect at all. But let's do 0.1. So now we have water over our dirt, but our tiles are still popping out over, which really sells the look. A water darkness is a little much, so 0.2. That way we can see the nice dirt color that we built up. And sludge depth, I can turn that up. Put the sludge opacity, maybe let's cut that in half. Or it might actually look good there. Last thing is maybe the water level is a bit much still. So let's try 0.075. I think that looks pretty good. The only really issue I notice now are these dark colors here. I don't really know what it's coming from. But I wonder if it's this sharpen node. Okay, it's not that. It's strange because I don't see it in our color map. Yeah, I don't know where these spots are coming from. But if I had to guess, it would be maybe this dark rock color here. So let's just lighten this up a bit and see if that fixes anything. Does not. So maybe it's this stone. It's pretty strange. So I really don't know what that's coming from. So I guess I'll just have to leave it there for now. And I think that the last issue that I have is that in the color map, this gradient map that colors our stone in for us is using the height map, which is fine. But the only problem is that this height map has a slope on it, which gives our stone slope. So what this gradient map is doing is darkening the stone the lower it gets. But with the slope there too, it's making the bottom half of every stone tile darker than the top, which I don't really want because the ambient occlusion does that anyways. So now the effect is a little too drastic and honestly like a little cartoonish. So what I could do is just copy all of this, but without doing this multiply here. So I'm going to copy. Okay, I'm going to select and copy all of this. So copy, and I'll just drop it down here for now. Okay, and now I'll delete anything I don't need. So I don't need this dirt mask. and I don't want that blend there. And I'm going to take this, and this is what will determine our stone color. Okay, and I'm going to have to copy this transform as well. Okay, so this is what determines our new stone color. So you can see it looks a lot better now that we're not also using the slope. The slope is fine, the height map, I just didn't want it to be in our color map. So I like this a lot more. And now that we're just using this to make the color of the stone, but it's not really affecting the height, we can go a little bit more drastic on some of these details. So for instance, this Gaussian noise, I'm going to crank that up. So, but first let me just name this. And I'll call it stone height for gradient map. So this Gaussian noise here, I can change that to something like 0.5, and it will affect the stone, but it won't actually affect the height. So we won't get crazy ambient occlusion happening. So maybe 0.25 looks pretty good. And anything else I don't really want to change, because if I were to change some of these edgeware options that I made with the slope layer grayscales, then it wouldn't necessarily coordinate with the roughness I have going on. So I don't want to change much more than that, but I just think that it looks much better now that I recopied, or that I copied this height and I just used it purely for this gradient map. So now I'm going to go into materials, definitions, and turn on tessellation, scale that up, maybe like 5. So that way we can sort of preview what we have going on here. So the height map looks good. The slope is still showing through. And you can see all these tiles are sloped in different ways. The rocks pop up nicely with that max light and blend node. And yeah, everything looks pretty good. I just wanted to try Parallax Occlusion as well. So yeah, I think this turned out pretty good. Trying to see if I see anything wrong with it, but I think I'm kind of nitpicking a little too much already. So I'm going to right click on our base material, create output nodes, and we do not need any hidden connectors. So now we can see our base color. Personally, depending on the project that you're doing, you might not want to sharpen these base colors, but I just want things to pop a little bit more. And also stone tends to have pretty sharp colors anyways, and a lot of little fragments and pebbles. So I think the sharpened node is good for what I'm doing and trying to get some more realism out of the texture. But if you're doing something more stylized, you definitely should keep it a little bit more blurry. Here's our normal map. Roughness, you can see any of these very dark spots are the roughness created by the water level node. Our metallic is just straight black because in the base material we determined that it would be dielectric, so no metallic at all, whereas white would mean very metallic. The ambient occlusion is pretty good, I think. Okay, so these black little artifacts here seem to be coming from the ambient occlusion. which is tough because the ambient occlusion, if we look at that, it's already at 0.01 anyways, and it's not here, so that's kind of strange. So I think it's something that's happening with the water level. Yeah, something between the ambient occlusion going into the water level and going out of it is affecting our base material. So I wonder what would happen if I just took the ambient occlusion and just put it directly into the base material. So that fixes those fragments. Okay, so I'm just going to do that instead, because there might be some type of bug or glitch happening in this water level that's sort of creating some artifacts in our ambient occlusion. So I'll just take the ambient occlusion before we put into the water level and just use that as our finalized base material ambient occlusion. So cool. So now we fix those artifacts too. And I think this is it for the material. So we'll just press this wrench icon here and export these outputs. Should only take a second. But yeah, guys, so that's it for this material. So thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, let me know what you think of this. Also, please feel free to subscribe if you enjoy this and you want to see more of this in the future. So yep, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.